The next speaker, Hervé Caniard, is a French living in Warsaw. He studied law in College of Europe in Bruges, then in Paris and Montreal. He works as a chief legal counselor for FRONTEX, which is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. The title of his paper today is Immigration Policies and Human Values.
Good morning, and thank you so much for your invitation. European border law is deeply rooted in secularism. The officials, EU officials or national officials, are also bound by this principle. But the practitioners are not robots, applying dryly technocratic norms. True, their work is about national security, but first and foremost, their work is to engage with men, women, and children seeking to cross the border or transit. Humanistic values can be, therefore, a beacon of light in case of gaps in the legislation or faced with exceptional situations. Even the secularist EU treaties acknowledge the inspiration drawn from the religious and humanist heritage of Europe. EU treaties promote the right of minorities, the humanist heritage of Europe. Pluralism, equality between men and women, fight against discrimination, including, of course, religious discrimination, rights of the child, and respect for family life. Surprisingly, or maybe I should say unsurprisingly, the Abu Dhabi speech on human fraternity does resonate with the EU treaties. In any case, beyond the law, what Abu Dhabi speech mentions, the values, are being tested daily at the EU borders. War refugees, displaced persons, unaccompanied children, victims of human trafficking, or even so-called economic migrants. How to protect their dignity while at the same time protecting the border, and how to do it in a multi-actors context. First, I will present how the European Union does its utmost to protect increasingly human beings at the border, based on the law, of course, but based also on the underpinning values. Second, I will showcase those values with some best practices at the border. Third, I will try to give you a snapshot of maritime search and rescue at sea. First, how to protect increasingly human beings crossing the border. Well, you can imagine it's difficult enough in a single country when done within a single administration. So let's imagine at the EU landscape. We have different states, different categories of law, which are intertwined, but sometimes not fully compatible. We have different languages, we have different categories of staff, different employers, and of course we have different working methods and culture. So in the EU, I don't want to speak at length because I don't want to do a lecture in EU law. We have 27 member states, as you know. But if you look at the Schengen space, the space without internal border control, you have 29 countries. So namely the 27 countries minus Cyprus, minus Ireland, plus 4 non-EU countries, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Iceland. So we have actually two clubs to simplify. And the fact we have a Schengen space without internal border control means we must, of course, reinforce the checks at the external border of the EU. And here comes an additional complexity. Of course, the member states are competent to check their section of the EU border, but the legislation which applies at the border is shared between the European Union and the member state. FRONTEX, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, has no decision-making power or no policy-making power, but we help to facilitate operational cooperation and solidarity. In many ways, but I just give you an example. We deploy officers of various countries in one special joint operation. For instance, we could have one French, one German, one Polish border guards, and many others deployed at the Greek-Turkish border. Since 2019, the agency can also deploy its own border guards, equipped with weapons. So it means, in short, more powers, and with more powers comes more responsibilities. Then the question is, what are the safeguards? How to protect and how to show duty of care? And even this question comes, the basic question is, why does it matter? So it matters, of course, because we try to emulate the democratic principle of EU, but first because border management takes place sometimes in isolated area or dangerous zone, for instance, the sea. Second, because law enforcement hinges to a great extent on being a trusted institution. If you want migrants to engage with you against smugglers, of course, the migrant must trust you. Third, because, same reasoning, you must build that trust far from Europe, among third countries. What happens, if I take an example, at the Polish border is of course important for Polish citizens, but it is also important for the citizens of those 27 or 29 other countries. And of course, it is seen outside the EU. We do not define the border with the old-fashioned concept of a dot, a border crossing point, where you cross the border, or a line, for instance, a forest, outside the border crossing point. Of course, this is still relevant, but today the border, we speak rather of a networked architecture of border control. Now, how to, the safeguards, precisely. Of course, there is a law, but the law is a yardstick. The law is very important, but the law cannot script everything, if you pass me the words. That's why the legislator, aware of this, has also built, apart from the legal instrument, spaces for dialogue. For instance, the Union maintains an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with churches and religious or philosophical organizations. I quote from the treaty. At practitioner level, this is also true. For instance, we have in FRONTEX an external consultative forum for fundamental rights where NGOs, international organizations are represented, and among them the Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe and the Jesuit Refugee Service. Then, apart from the space of dialogue, we have the values, the overarching values, which exist in addition to the law and sometimes even contra legem or supra legem. So we have in abstracto the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, which is a kind of constitution for the EU, which refers to, again, the religious heritage of Europe, the diversity, the freedom of religion. And we have in concreto the FRONTEX regulation, in concreto because applied to border management. So the FRONTEX regulation mentions more than 200 times fundamental right law. Well, it is useful, yes, but is it enough? No. It also mentions values. It's more difficult to see because, of course, the legislator is uncomfortable with values. But still, the FRONTEX regulation mentions, of course, respect for human dignity. It mentions a surprising fact, the fact that even though the primary duty of FRONTEX is to side with the law enforcement, if I simplify, in other words, help the police or the border police, the regulation also mentions humanitarian emergencies that could prevail. In other words, our role changes. The regulation mentioned also another surprising fact, namely, even so the member state can punish irregular border crossing, the regulation, the FRONTEX regulation, encourages those member states to decide not to impose criminal sanction to those who assist, where the goal of the assistance is humanitarian help. Of course, it does not concern the smuggler, but you see the idea, if I may say, primum non nocere, for those who help. Then the regulation mentioned a shared responsibility. I don't need to be long. Shared responsibility is broader than law. It implies a moral dimension. And at last, we have the duty to recruit candidates in the agency, especially those we deploy in the field, that must share high ethical values. Now, how to demonstrate those values? Well, in obvious cases, by abstaining to cooperate with dangerous countries. So we have suspended cooperation with Afghanistan and with Belarus. Belarus in particular, because they were manipulating migrants and even weaponizing migrants, for instance, by giving them food in exchange of tools for migrants to attack the Polish border fence. There are less obvious cases where we try to rethink our operational cooperation. Further to judgment issued by the Court of Justice of the EU. I don't need to give you the details, but in 2020 and 22, judgments were issued against Hungary and Lithuania because their national law was not fully compliant with EU law. Were they addressed to FRONTEX, those judgments? No. Nevertheless, we acted upon those judgments by downscaling here and there our operational cooperation at the concerned geographical zone. We can also do it at our own initiative. For instance, the executive director may or shall suspend or terminate an operational activity supported by FRONTEX or refuse to finance this activity in case of serious or persistent violation of fundamental rights or international protection obligation. Now, values govern behavior. I just give you two examples on how to promote accountability. Compliance with law is good, but accountability is better. Two examples very quickly. We have set up in the last 10 years 3 codes of conduct, a general one for all staff, a field one for those who are at the border, and a very specialized one for expulsion of migrants, which is very sensitive activity, as you can imagine. We have also set up independent monitor. We have a fundamental right officer, a manager who is independent, who overviews 50 or 60 independent monitors in the field. Of course, they respect the law, but by their behavior, they try to embody the values, and they try to have a bigger, broader picture. I will now move on to enumerating some best practices at the border that foster dignity, compassion, and duty of care. I have broken down those practices in two families, two categories: general best practices and best practices dedicated to children. If I turn to the first basket, I give you a mosaic or a patchwork of very diverse best practices, and you will indulge me, please, if I jump from one to another in a telegraphic style, for the sake of time. First, and it's very close to my heart, dignity. Well, dignity starts with semantics. We do not refer to illegal alien. We refer to a person having irregularly crossed the border, because no human being is illegal. And the fact you are in an irregular situation can also change over time. Dignity, then, when interacting with persons of different faiths. In certain religions, it's forbidden to touch a woman, even so it is well-intentioned, for instance, guiding this person in a queue. We give instruction not to do that, to respect different faiths and different culture. And we do deploy a female officer. We then have a broad definition of what vulnerable persons mean. It means children, single parents with children, the disabled, the seriously sick or wounded, pregnant women, person with mental disorders, the elderly, victim of trafficking, victim of sexual violence, victim of torture. It's quite broad and it's not exhaustive. We then try to give a voice to migrants. Since 2016, at the initiative of the European Ombudsman, we have set up an administrative mechanism where migrants can give feedback and complain. FRONTEX advertised the mechanism and make sure it is available at all the border crossing points, and translated the mechanism in many non-EU languages, for instance, Arabic, Urdu, Pashto, and many others. We even allow for anonymous complaint. Ukraine at war. Well, unsurprisingly, the Russian aggression led to millions of persons fleeing their country. Poland and also other neighboring countries were exemplary in showing solidarity, opening their border and welcoming refugees, even without valid documents. And for those who crossed the border outside the border crossing point, for instance in the forest, they were also welcome, even though having irregularly crossed the border. Our fundamental rights officer also supported initiatives such as giving information to refugees about possibility to complain about war crime, or the way to secure evidence for future use, maybe by the International Criminal Court. Return. Return is a very sensitive activity. It means expulsion. And of course, increasingly, we encourage voluntary return, but sometimes it is forced return. In that case, some best practices, I mentioned some best practices as follows. The escort leader has to introduce himself and engage with each returnee individually. We do organize presence of interpreter and medical personnel. We allow access to mobile phone. We ask vulnerable person to board the plane, if it's a plane, first. Although FRONTEX does not take decision about return decision, we check the existence of an enforceable document issued by a judge or a competent authority. We also make sure that each returnee has a fit to travel medical document. And those who are deemed not fit to travel, of course, are not returned. And we give them this document for them to justify their condition and their right. We monitor the operation, we record the operation. We ask all staff, FRONTEX staff or member state staff, to be identified by a name tag or a personal identification number. And after arrival in the country of the returnee, we give some of them access to social programs. I started with dignity. I will end up this section with dignity. Registration of migrants rescued at sea. When they are rescued at sea, we do not debrief them. It's a mandatory procedure, the debriefing, immediately upon disembarkation. On the case side, this is bad practice. We allow them proper time to rest. Now I will turn towards best practices concerning children. Children are a sizable category for victims of trafficking, more than 35%. We have developed a program for many years called Vega Children, and the primary role of this program is for border guards to identify children at risk, refer them to welfare authorities, and of course, disrupt criminal networks. Children, it will not be surprising, are exposed to a very high number of risks. Borders are a unique opportunities to detect those children. Once they leave the border area, the chances we can help decrease dramatically. I'll give you a few best practices, but first, key principle. The best interest of the child is the primary consideration when taking a decision. Then comes to maintain family unity, but at the same time to separate children traveling with an impostor. I mean an adult who are not family, but most likely smugglers. We do recommend using personnel with specific child protection expertise. We try to use child-friendly procedure, including complaint mechanism available for children, according to their level of maturity. We try to seek the opinion of the child. We try to check databases on child abduction. We strongly believe that no detention of children is necessary, or if it would be based on due to violent behavior, then they have to be detained temporarily, of course, not with adults. A recent success story, police systematically vetting transport companies who operate in the border area, setting up fast-track reception center for children, appointing very swiftly a legal guardian for each child, unaccompanied child below 15 years old, and have dedicated leisure facilities. The last one, about age assessment procedure. It's sometimes difficult to tell apart adults from teenagers. And of course, if you are a child, you are entitled to special benefits. So in our recommendation, there are, of course, some procedure, medical procedure, psychological procedure, but they do not give 100% certainty. So our fundamental rights officer strongly recommended that each undocumented migrant claiming to be a minor be treated as such. In the last part of my presentation, I will address search and rescue. So here you see a map of the Mediterranean Sea, Mare Nostrum. But there is a saying in maritime circles, the sea does not discriminate. And indeed, this is a guiding principle. Any person in distress at sea must be rendered assistance, irrespective of his or her nationality or status or the circumstances in which that person is found. So regularly you listen in the media concern or even outrage related to the death toll at sea. I share this, I hear those voices and I share this frustration. At the same time, it is fair to say that the situation is very complicated. First, the EU also has a goal to reduce the death toll at sea. Is not the decision-making body for search and rescue. It comes from United Nations International Convention, international maritime law, more than EU law. Then you have, as you can see, you have a number of different search and rescue zones. And without entering into the details, you can see that leaving aside the fact that there are numerous, there are some unclear zones. For instance, overlapping zone, for instance, the Greek-Turkish zone, but also the Moroccan-Spanish zone or the Italian or Maltese zone. They are overlapping, and when they are not overlapping, it's difficult to know who should launch the rescue operation. So what I can say is that the authority in charge is, under international law, is called the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. It's governed by national law. It is under the decision-making power of states, not the European Commission, not FRONTEX. What can FRONTEX do? To monitor, to alert, to assist. But we cannot give instruction to a vessel to do a search and rescue operation. We do not have this power. We also do not have our own vessel, so we cannot substitute ourselves to states. Nevertheless, we try to help, I believe, because since, and to some extent successfully, because in last year we directly or indirectly supported the rescue of 43,000 persons at sea. Interestingly, what happens? In case of distress, as I said, our role changes. We do not do border surveillance anymore. We put our maritime assets under the command of the famous Maritime Rescue Coordination Center I was mentioning earlier. So our mandate is, our goal, I could say, changes. There is a switch in the legal framework, and there is a switch in the authority issuing instruction. I will end up by giving you two good practices at sea that we have developed and implemented. We have a duty to alert, to assist in case of distress, but we try to do more. We try to do proactive monitoring. Why? Because the seaworthiness of a vessel, of a boat with migrants, can deteriorate very swiftly at sea. Therefore, when we are in a situation of uncertainty, we monitor the vessel through drones or airplane mostly, and we alert the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. And we try to pass on relevant information: type of vessel, how many persons on board, availability of supplies such as fuel, water, food, availability of communication equipment, of qualified crew. Usually there is no qualified crew. Presence of vulnerable person, weather forecast, likelihood the boat will reach its destination. This is one best practice. A second one, to quote only two, is the disembarkation of migrants. EU law and international law do authorize FRONTEX and member state, European member state, to disembark migrants intercepted in the rescued in the Mediterranean Sea outside EU territory, for instance, in a port on the southern part of the Mediterranean. It is allowed under a fundamental right safeguard and condition, but we do not do it. All the migrants intercepted or rescued are disembarked in the naval port of a European Union member state. Concluding, even so, the institutional framework in which practitioners operate is rather secularist, modern border policing practices can emulate at least some of the values mentioned in the Abu Dhabi speech. Thank you very much for your attention.